I never thought I'd have to explain to a police officer why the president of my HOA threatened to cut my oxygen line. It all started on a humid Tuesday morning in June, the kind where your shirt sticks to your back before you even make it down the porch steps. I was just trying to get my trash bins back inside before the HOA sent another fine. That's when I spotted her again, Vivica Arlington. Mid-50s, always in a pastel cardigan no matter the weather, clipboard fused to her hand like it was a limb. Mr. Adler Davis, she called out, walking across my lawn like it belonged to her. We've had several complaints about your medical equipment being an eyesore. I blinked, confused. My oxygen concentrator, it's in my garage, you can't even see it. She ignored that. The hose runs out when you're using it, visible from the street, violates community standards. Her voice was flat, rehearsed, like she'd been waiting to say that all week. I've had copped for over 3 years. The machine keeps me alive. The tube only stretches a few feet when I sit outside in the mornings. I need the air, and the sun helps me breathe a little easier. Vivica, I said, trying to stay level, if it's about appearances, I'll cover the hose with a neutral color or something. But you're not seriously suggesting, she cut me off. If it's not removed entirely during daylight hours, we'll be forced to take action. Her eyes narrowed. Some of the board members have discussed disabling it if it continues to breach community standards. I stared at her. You're threatening my life over a plastic tube. She didn't deny it. She turned and walked off like she hadn't just said the most insane thing I've heard in my 49 years of living. I stood there stunned, watching her pastel figure disappear down the sidewalk. She didn't look back. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every hiss of the concentrator made me paranoid. I kept checking the hose, the plug, the power. I even set up an old motion sensor camera I'd used for raccoons in the backyard. If they tried anything, I'd have proof. 3 days later, I had more than proof. I was sitting in my garage, reading the paper, the hose tucked neatly beside me when my security app pinged. I pulled it up and saw her Vivica sneaking around the side of my house with a bolt cutter in her hand. She tiptoed like a cartoon villain, clearly not realizing I had a camera angled right at the garage window. I burst out laughing, which turned into a cough. My lungs weren't built for anger. I opened the garage door with the remote and stepped into the sunlight. Vivica, I called out. Need help with something? She froze like a deer in headlights, bolt cutters halfway to the hose. You're trespassing, I added. She straightened up like nothing happened. I'm on official HOA business. The board voted to remove unauthorized modifications. Modifications, I coughed again. Lady, it's medical equipment. This isn't a patio umbrella. You've had ample warning, she snapped. You've left us no choice. I held up my phone, the camera still rolling. You're going to jail, her face twitched. Don't be ridiculous, the HOA has limited immunity. Your threats won't work. She turned and walked briskly back to her car. I didn't stop recording until she pulled away. The next morning, I drove straight to the sheriff's office. I showed the footage to Deputy Ramirez, a guy I knew from high school. You're telling me she tried to cut your oxygen line? He asked, eyes wide. That's exactly what I'm telling you. He watched the video twice, then leaned back in his chair. That's not just trespassing, that's attempted battery, maybe even attempted manslaughter. I didn't say anything. I just nodded. He whistled low. And you said she's head of the HOA, president for the last 3 years, runs the board like she's queen of the cul-de-sac. He turned to his computer. We're opening an investigation. You've got the footage, the threat, and the attempted sabotage. If even half of what you're saying is true, this lady's in serious trouble. I handed over a printed log of all the warnings, fines, and emails she'd sent me. I'd been documenting her nonsense for years. This was the final straw. When I got back home, I found an envelope taped to my door. Another fine, this one for obstruction of community harmony. I laughed so hard I nearly passed out. That night I went door to door in the neighborhood. I wasn't the only one Vivica had harassed. One guy got fined for having a non-regulation bird feeder. A nurse down the street got a warning because her scrubs drying on a clothesline were unprofessional. A retired Army vet got written up for flying an American flag that wasn't HOA approved. I compiled everything into a neat little document with names, dates, and violations. I called it Vivica's Greatest Hits. I printed 20 copies and brought them to the next HOA meeting. I wasn't even on the agenda, but I walked in anyway. The meeting was held at the local community center, where they usually discuss things like fence colors and shrub trimming. This time, I had a different plan. Vivica sat at the head of the table like always, flanked by her two loyal board members Ruth and Dennis, the human equivalent of wet toast. Vivica spotted me and frowned. "Mr. Davis, you're not scheduled to speak tonight." I held up the folder. "I think what I've got is worth hearing." She opened her mouth to object, but I beat her to it. Vivica Arlington trespassed onto my property and attempted to sabotage my medical equipment. I've got video proof, and the sheriff's department is already investigating. But it doesn't stop there. I passed out the folders to the other homeowners sitting in the back. Inside, you'll find a full record of her abuse of power, fines for bird feeders, warnings for clothing choices, threats over flags and garden gnomes. All of it backed up by emails and letters. People started flipping through the pages. A buzz went through the room. I saw Ruth's mouth drop open. Dennis adjusted his glasses, suddenly very interested in the table. Vivica's face turned the color of spoiled milk. "This is a smear campaign," she said, voice shaking. "You people have no idea what I've done to preserve the value of this neighborhood." "Cutting someone's oxygen line doesn't preserve anything," I said. "That's attempted murder." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. I looked around. "Anyone else here ever been threatened by Vivica?" Hands went up, one by one, a dozen, then more. That's when I knew I wasn't alone in this, and Vivica? She was done. The fallout started before the HOA meeting even ended. Vivica had barely managed to gather her papers when Officer Grayson entered through the back door of the community center. He was tall, built like a linebacker, and carried that calm, deliberate authority that made people instinctively sit up straighter. His eyes scanned the room until they found me near the folding chairs. "You Adler Davis?" he asked, walking past a stunned Ruth and Dennis without so much as a glance. I nodded and stood. "You here for her?" He didn't answer. Instead, he addressed the room. "Miss Arlington, I'd like you to come with me. We have some questions regarding a criminal complaint, including attempted tampering with life-sustaining medical equipment." Vivica's mouth opened, but nothing came out. She clutched her clipboard tighter like it might deflect the law. "I'll speak with my attorney before saying anything," she finally managed, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. Grayson nodded. "That's your right, ma'am, but we still need you to come down to the station." As she walked out, the silence in the room was deafening. For the first time in years, Vivica didn't control the air in that place. I watched her leave, and I swear, the fluorescent lights seemed to burn a little brighter once she was gone. After the meeting, people lingered in small groups, talking in hushed but excited tones. I stepped outside for air, but I didn't make it far before someone approached me. "Mr. Davis, I'm Lydia Chen. I live on Bayberry Lane." I recognized her face from the neighborhood but hadn't spoken to her before. "I just wanted to thank you," she said. "She fined me twice last year for putting up a temporary ramp for my dad's wheelchair. Said it didn't match the aesthetic. I didn't know what to do." "That's disgusting," I said, "but you're not the only one." She glanced around. "Do you think there's a way to get her off the board permanently?" I had already been thinking about that. "We'll need to gather enough signatures to force a recall election. The bylaws require 30% of the homeowners to sign. But if this arrest turns into charges, she might be removed automatically." Lydia looked relieved. "I'll help any way I can." Over the next several days, the neighborhood transformed. People who had never spoken to each other were suddenly swapping stories, comparing notices, compiling emails. I started keeping a log of violations that people provided, some so petty they felt like parody. A woman named Carol had been fined for using a hose nozzle that was too industrial. Another man, Marcus, had received a citation for leaving his garage door open for longer than necessary. When I cross-referenced the violations with board member addresses, a pattern emerged. Vivica's friends, those who had backed her in elections or defended her decisions at meetings, had almost no violations. A few hadn't received a single notice in 3 years. I compiled the data into a spreadsheet and brought it to Deputy Ramirez at the Sheriff's Department. He studied it, then looked up at me with a grim expression. "This isn't just harassment. This is selective enforcement with malicious intent. If she used her authority to target certain residents while protecting others, that's abuse of power. In some cases, it could even be considered fraud." "You think it's enough to bring charges?" I asked. He leaned back. "We've already got attempted sabotage. If we can prove she used HOA funds to pursue personal vendettas or penalized residents unfairly while ignoring the rules for others, we're looking at civil damages. Possibly criminal misappropriation if money was involved. Money was involved. That much I could prove." I went digging through the HOA's financial disclosures, something most residents ignored because the reports were dense and filled with vague line items. But I used to work in municipal auditing back in the day, and I still knew how to read between the lines. I noticed repeated payments to a landscaping company called Green Pinnacle Services, more than double what neighboring HOAs were paying for similar work. I visited the address listed on the invoice. It was a rundown strip mall with a mailbox rental business. No sign of a landscaping company. I made a few calls and eventually got a hold of a guy named Brent who used to work at Green Pinnacle before it disappeared. He told me they'd done a few jobs for the HOA 3 years ago, but then stopped hearing from them. He was surprised to hear they were still being paid. That was the missing link. I brought the discovery to Ramirez, who passed it on to the county prosecutor. Within 48 hours, a warrant was issued to seize the HOA's financial records. Ruth and Dennis tried to block it, claiming it was internal documentation, but the judge didn't buy it. The warrant also allowed access to Vivica's personal accounts. That's where they found the smoking gun. Several transfers from the HOA's reserve fund to a personal LLC she had created under her maiden name. The LLC had no employees, no website, and no business activity, just deposits and withdrawals that matched the landscaping payments. The local news picked up the story that week. They ran a headline that read, "HOA President under investigation for fraud and sabotage." A reporter even showed up on my lawn, asking for an interview. I declined, at least for now. I wasn't doing this for attention. I just wanted to breathe without being harassed. Once news broke, the community response was swift. Someone started a petition to dissolve the current board. Within 3 days, over 80% of the homeowners had signed it. The county held an emergency hearing, and the HOA was placed under temporary outside management while the investigation continued. Meanwhile, Vivica was charged with felony fraud, attempted assault, and abuse of fiduciary duty. She was released on bond but barred from contacting any residents or setting foot in the neighborhood. The interim HOA manager, an attorney named Carla Vance, contacted me personally. She thanked me for coming forward and asked if I'd be willing to serve on a temporary oversight committee until a new board could be elected. I said yes, on one condition. I wanted a motion passed to make all future HOA meetings open to residents, with full transcripts posted online. No more decisions in secret. Carla agreed. The first meeting under the interim leadership was held in the clubhouse gymnasium. Folding chairs lined the walls, and the turnout was bigger than any HOA event in recent memory. People brought their kids. Someone brought donuts. The mood was cautiously optimistic. Carla stood at the podium and read a prepared statement about transparency and rebuilding trust. Then she opened the floor. I stepped up and took the mic. I've lived in this neighborhood for 17 years. I bought my house here because it felt like a community, but somewhere along the way that stopped being true. We let one person turn this place into a fiefdom, and we let fear keep us quiet. I paused. No one interrupted. But we're not afraid anymore. We've seen what happens when we stand together, so let's make sure this never happens again. The room erupted in applause, real, honest applause, not the awkward kind people give out of politeness. After the meeting, a few folks came up to thank me. A teenager approached and said he was inspired to volunteer for the community garden again. A couple from the East Side asked if I'd consider running for HOA president when elections came around. I told them I'd think about it. Truth be told, I was still tired. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe freely, not just because of the air from my concentrator, but because the weight of constant hostility was gone. And that, more than anything, was worth fighting for. The first thing I noticed was that the mail started arriving late. Not just by an hour or two, by days. Letters came pre-opened, some even taped shut sloppily like a kid trying to hide that he'd peeked at Christmas presents. It was subtle at first, just enough to feel like paranoia. But then, I stopped receiving key documents entirely: account statements, utility notices. Even my prescription delivery went missing. I had a gut feeling this wasn't clerical error. I called the post office and got routed through 3 different departments before reaching someone who sounded like they actually knew what they were doing. "You're Adler Davis, right? On Sycamore?" the clerk asked. "That's me." There was a pause, then a low whistle. "We've had 3 separate mail holds placed on your address in the last 30 days, all filed online." I didn't do that. Didn't think so. I flagged the last one myself. It was filed using a fake email address tied to a suspended IP. I gripped the phone tighter. "Can you tell who did it?" "I can't say officially, but the IP address was traced back to a commercial terminal in the Ridgewood HOA office complex. Take that however you want." I didn't need to take it anyway. I already knew. Vivica might have been banned from the neighborhood, but someone was still acting on her behalf. Ruth and Dennis had both kept their heads down since the investigation began, but their silence had started to look less like shame and more like strategy. That night, I moved the camera I'd originally installed near the garage and set up a new one above the mailbox. I didn't tell anyone, not even the interim board. I wanted to see who was still playing dirty 3 days past. Then, just before dawn on a Thursday, the camera caught a shadowy figure stepping out of a silver hatchback, hood up, gloves on, walking straight to my mailbox. The footage was grainy in the low light, but the person didn't act like a stranger. They moved with the confidence of someone who thought they owned the place. They used a key, not a crowbar, not a pick. A key. I drove to the HOA office that morning and requested access logs, something Carla had made public the moment she took over. While they didn't track mailbox access directly, they did list issued master keys. According to the log, only 5 master keys existed. 1 had been assigned to Vivica, another to Ruth. The other 3 were documented as returned. I brought the footage to Carla. "You're telling me someone with a master key tampered with your mail?" she asked, watching the video with narrowed eyes. "Not just tampered. They filed fake holds, intercepted deliveries, and opened personal documents. That's federal." Carla didn't say anything for a moment. Then she stood, picked up the phone, and called the county prosecutor's office. By the following morning, federal postal inspectors had joined the investigation. They seized the HOA's master key log and ran a fingerprint analysis on my mailbox. The results confirmed what I already suspected: Ruth's prints were on the key and the box. She was arrested the next day at her home 2 streets over. The charges included federal mail fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy to interfere with a federal investigation. The second charge caught my attention. "What investigation?" I asked Ramirez when he came by to deliver the news. He looked at me carefully before answering. "There's more going on than just misuse of HOA funds. During the audit, we found evidence suggesting that Vivica and her inner circle were funneling HOA reserve money into a private account. then using it to purchase property elsewhere under different LLCs. Property, vacant lots, commercial parcels, all under shell companies. Looks like they were planning to create a new HOA under a different name and start the scam all over again somewhere else. Using our dues to fund their next operation. I shook my head. That's organized fraud. Ramirez nodded. That's exactly what the state attorney is calling it. It didn't take long for the story to explode. Local reporters picked it up first, then a regional paper ran a front-page feature under the headline, HOA fraud ring busted, medical sabotage, mail tampering, and real estate scheme uncovered in Ridgewood. The article named names: Vivica, Ruth, Dennis. Even a former board treasurer who had quietly resigned a year earlier and moved out of state. The neighborhood changed overnight. People who had kept their heads down during Vivica's reign began stepping up, volunteering for committees, repainting public benches, planting flowers near the clubhouse. The mood was lighter, conversations friendlier. Even the kids who used to avoid the cul-de-sac started riding their bikes there again. A week later, the county held a restitution hearing. I wasn't planning to speak, but Carla insisted. "You're the reason this thing unraveled," she told me. People need to hear that, so I went. The courthouse was packed. Cameras lined the back wall. Vivica sat at the defense table, no cardigan this time, just a gray blazer that looked 2 sizes too tight and a face that had aged 10 years in as many weeks. I took the stand and told the story beginning to end. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I just laid it all out. The threats, the sabotage, the harassment, the fraud. The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for zero tolerance on abuse of authority, listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned slightly forward. "There's something particularly insidious," she said, "about using a position of communal trust to target and exploit the vulnerable. This wasn't just theft. This was psychological warfare." Vivica didn't look up. The court ordered her and the other board members to pay over $200,000 in restitution to the HOA. The state froze their personal assets. The feds filed additional charges for financial conspiracy across state lines. Vivica's bail was revoked after investigators discovered she'd attempted to transfer property titles to a cousin in another county. That same evening, Carla called an emergency community meeting. She stood at the front of the room, smiling for the first time in weeks. "We've been through a lot," she said, "but tonight I want us to vote on something important." She introduced a proposal, the Ridgewood Transparency Amendment. It would permanently limit board authority, require all financial decisions to be approved by a majority of homeowners, and mandate third-party audits every year. The vote was unanimous. After the meeting, as people filed out, a few neighbors stayed behind to talk. One of them, an older man named Harold who'd barely spoken at previous meetings, walked up to me with a barely concealed grin. "You know," he said, "when you first moved in, Vivica told everyone you were trouble, said you'd be a problem homeowner." I raised an eyebrow. "Did she now?" Harold nodded. "Turns out she was right, just not for the reason she thought." We both laughed. A real one, not the exhausted kind I'd gotten used to. That night I sat on my porch. No fines on the door, no strange cars idling nearby, just quiet, peaceful. My oxygen concentrator hummed gently beside me, the hose curled neatly at my feet. For the first time in months, I didn't have to watch my back. I didn't have to worry about retaliation or sabotage or some phony citation nailed to my mailbox. I just breathed, and this time it was easy. The neighborhood newsletter arrived the following week, printed on clean white cardstock and bearing the new Ridgewood logo, a simple circular emblem with 3 trees, and the words transparency, community, accountability. It was the first edition in over a year that didn't include a list of violations or a message from Vivica. Instead, it opened with a letter from Carla Vance titled, "A New Chapter." The HOA reform process had picked up speed. In less than 2 months, The bylaws had been rewritten, reserve funds were being audited by an independent firm, and a new board election was scheduled for late August. Residents had submitted their candidate applications, and for the first time in the neighborhood's history, every position was contested. I hadn't planned on running. But when the nomination form appeared in my mailbox, this time delivered properly, I saw my name already written in the president line, the handwriting unmistakably Lydia's. She'd even stapled a sticky note to the top that read, "Don't pretend you're not already doing the job." I didn't remove it. I filled in the rest of the form and dropped it off at the clubhouse the same afternoon. Campaigning was informal. No yard signs, no speeches, just casual conversations at porches, community cleanup events, and the Saturday pancake breakfast hosted by the interim board. People asked real questions. How do we prevent another Vivica? What happens if a future board tries to hide financial records again? Should we eliminate fines entirely? I answered truthfully. I didn't promise perfection. I promised vigilance. 2 days before the election, Carla asked me to meet her at the county building. She said there was something I needed to see. When I arrived, she was seated in a small office alongside a detective I hadn't met before, a woman with cropped hair and a badge clipped to a navy blue blazer. Carla introduced her as Detective Mara Ellison with the State Financial Crimes Division. Ellison handed me a file. We've completed the forensic review of the HOA's financial records going back 6 years. What started as embezzlement turned out to be part of a larger operation. I opened the folder. It contained a flowchart, lines connecting names, LLCs, and property parcels stretching across 3 counties. Vivica wasn't just using Ridgewood funds, Ellison said. She was coordinating with 2 other HOA presidents in nearby developments. They created shell companies, funneled dues through fake service contracts, and used the funds to buy distressed properties at tax auctions. Then they'd flip the parcels using inflated appraisals and pocket the difference. My stomach tightened. You're saying this was organized to an extent that surprised even us. They used their authority to push out elderly homeowners, delay maintenance to lower property values, and then offer to buy homes at below-market rates through third-party buyers they secretly controlled. Carla leaned forward. We think they targeted residents who had no immediate family. People unlikely to fight back, Ellison nodded. We've located 16 properties purchased under this scheme. Several have already been sold. We're working to freeze the proceeds. I clenched the edge of the folder. How many people lost their homes? 8. We've reached out to their families. One case is particularly serious. An elderly man with dementia was coerced into signing a quitclaim deed. His niece only found out after she came to visit and found the locks changed. Carla looked sick. We're filing a civil suit on behalf of the HOA to recover what we can. The county is pursuing criminal charges against all 3 HOA presidents. Vivica's facing an expanded list of charges: wire fraud, elder abuse, racketeering. Ellison closed the folder. We'll need witness testimony. Your documentation was the key that unraveled all of this. We'll be calling you for the grand jury. I walked out of that office carrying the weight of people I'd never met, neighbors who'd suffered quietly while Vivica smiled in her cardigan and handed out gardening tips. The election happened 2 days later in the community center's multipurpose room. Ballots were cast in person, and the turnout was nearly total. Carla announced the results that evening in a live stream broadcast on the neighborhood site. I won by a landslide. Lydia was elected vice president. Harold, the quiet man from the east side, took the treasurer role. The new board pledged to serve only 1 term, and we passed a motion the same night to limit future terms to 2 years, non-renewable. My first official act as president was to approve the budget for community repairs, including the sidewalk ramp Lydia had once been fined over. My second was to approve a grant for the installation of new streetlights in the South Loop, the area most neglected during Vivica's reign. The next month was a blur of paperwork, meetings, and cleanup events. Residents began volunteering for committees again. The community garden expanded. Marcus, the man previously cited for his garage door, started a woodworking club in the clubhouse basement. One morning, as I was hauling bags of mulch from the truck bed, Lydia walked over holding a manila envelope. "This came from Carla's office," she said. "You might want to read it." Inside were the final restitution amounts recovered from the fraudulent property sales, over $700,000. The funds were being divided proportionally among the 3 affected HOA communities. Ridgewood's share was nearly $230,000. We used the money to fund a neighborhood scholarship. Each year, a student from Ridgewood would receive full tuition to a local community college. The first recipient was a high school senior named Tasha who wanted to study environmental science. Her father, a quiet man who'd once been fined for having too many solar lights on his lawn, cried when we handed her the certificate. By mid-autumn, Vivica was convicted on 12 felony counts. Her sentencing hearing was broadcast on the local news. She received 13 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 7. The judge read a statement during sentencing that echoed what I'd said months earlier: authority without accountability is not leadership. It is exploitation, and in this case it was criminal. No one from Ridgewood attended the hearing. We didn't need to. The neighborhood had moved on, slowly, purposefully. One chilly evening in late October, I sat on my porch, watching maple leaves scatter across the sidewalk like confetti. The air was clean, the kind that made each breath feel earned. My concentrator hummed beside me, steady and reliable. Lydia crossed the street, carrying 2 mugs of something steaming. "Apple cider," she said, setting one down on the railing. "No HOA regulation against that." I raised the mug. "Yet," she laughed, then sat beside me. "You ever think about how close we came to losing this place?" she asked. "Every day," she nodded. "It's better now, not perfect, but better." I took a sip. The cider was warm, spiced just right. "You know," I said, "when I moved here, I thought I was buying a house. Turns out I was buying into something a lot bigger." She looked out at the street, where kids were racing their bikes past the community bulletin board. Someone had pinned a flyer for a winter coat drive. "Well," she said, "you helped build it." I didn't say anything. I just sat, letting the silence settle around us like a comfortable sweater. The air was cold, but for the first time in a long while it felt like home.